Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new taste to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrywka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. The average person eats around 35 tons of food during a lifetime. Of course, the exact amount varies according to gender, size, diet, lifespan, and geopolitical location, but still, it's quite an enormous amount. Can we actually tell the story of someone's life through food? I asked this question to Zayaan Khan, an ecological artist based in Cape Town, South Africa. She works with multidisciplinary and multi-species strategies to question the different ways we consume. Join us in this conversation to know more about Zayaan's story about food.
I think we should start, since this is the journey that I'm on currently, in that my first foods of life, my mother will never let me forget, is that I was breastfed for 3 years, which is not, I know in Europe it's much more common, but here it's not so common. And so when people hear you say, you were breastfed for 3 years, what? But so I've this idea of nourishment and familial tie, I think, is embedded in who I am. Whenever I had the option as a kid, I loved and still do loved fruits. Fruit was like an opportunity in the summertime. I used to freeze all the fruits and then eat them, kind of like scrape them apart and eat them frozen. This was very different to a lot of the other kids that I grew up with. And so when in this thing about agency, like fruit is easy to pick off the counter, right? But when I had money, the only thing that I wanted to buy from the shop was rice paper, which they sold, I think, was half a cent per sheet, or like 2 sheets or something, and sweets. And the sweets I was so involved with the sweets that all my teeth fell out. And so always had this very weird relationship with teeth, like weird and wonderful. I really appreciate teeth. um, um, but basically, I think one of the things that one culminates around my food childhood was that growing up, our food traditions were very different to our peers. In our schooling, for example, we were the only ones who were eating the kinds of food we were, and kind of our cultural upbringing is what we call Cape Malay. It's not a typical Malay cuisine. It's a mix of a whole bunch of things that found itself here in the Cape over a few hundred years. But it's itself become quite synonymous with this place. But back then, it wasn't what the other kids were eating, and so it was always a little bit left of center, but always special. And even within our community, in our family, we would be eating things that not many other people would still, meals that people would be making. So sheep trotters cooked with tomato stew and sugar to make it what we called sticky food, but it's basically just trotters. And then I think we can quickly fast forward. I was very sickly as a child, and then kind of trying to gain a kind of understanding as to what my health was and how to fix it. So I would get, for example, sinus flu. I'd be sick at least 4 times a year, and then I'd be out for 2 weeks at a time. Very kind of stressful. I would always kind of have this feeling that if I was an animal, like say I was an impala in the veld, like the hyenas would have taken me down quickly because I was weak in many ways. And if I'm weak for myself, then I must be weak for my herd. So I must have been around, like thinking around these things around the age of 16, but only really going into it at about 19, when I could start to see differences and start to look at solutions that were working for me. So just as a general example, to stop washing with chemically kind of toiletries, and really just looking at things in their simplicity. It was this at the same time that my interest in plants was fostered, and the plants led me to like very interesting and intricate and wonderful spaces and places. And one of it was to understand health, from the way that we keep ourselves clean to the way that we, I guess, beautify ourselves, or look at the kind of politics of aesthetics, I guess, through plants, and through indigenous knowledge. And because Southern Africa is really such, there's been just compounding, as many other places, just compounding colonial efforts that culminated into an apartheid regime that really killed so much of our knowledge, and not just killed it, but put a lot of shame into what knowledge is, that's not from an imperial source. And so having to excavate through all the aesthetics of the time, which was, for example, there was a lot of shame to have hair that wasn't straight, but my hair is so far from straight. And so you would like laboriously kind of go through all this, to ensure that you looked a certain way, and I could never understand, like, why am I fighting like just to look a certain way? This is really expensive for my time, and I really don't want to be doing this. And so like my mother would say that I rebelled, but it really wasn't a rebellion. It was a rebellion from, I guess, a systemic way of thinking, but more just trying to get back to what is that natural way of being. If I was an impala, how would how would my hair look? No, if I was an impala, what would those paths have been from the get go to where I am now, to ensure that I could be healthy, and not just healthy, but it's that thing about, yes, we can survive, but we should be thriving. Why am I not thriving? And so carving out, all the dependencies that one has in terms of the way that capitalism has captured our cultures and our habits. I was able to find solutions that worked for me. So a simple example would be finding local honeycomb and propolis and so on to cure myself from sinusitis, which I managed to do over about 2 years of consuming these honeycombs. I guess another example is this thinking through the straightness of the hair, and how the politics of hair actually, and the peace that I came to myself through plants, through food, was, I think, a big solution was when I started brewing kombucha, although we should say fermented tea. No? So using fermented tea to make an acetic tea, so a kind of a vinegar, or just letting the ferment go longer, and using it as a conditioner for my hair, because apple cider vinegar was far too strong, far too acidic. But indigenous knowledge speaks about our local, what's kind of affectionately or colloquially called wild rosemary, or kapopos, which is a kind of herbaceous plant that grows similar to rosemary, and it has a similar smell. But it's also known to be very good for use on hair. And so that, taking the SCOBY from the fermented tea and thinking through, okay, if we know that this mother, or the SCOBY, likes to be tannin rich, or likes tannin rich plants, the fynbos biome where I live is full of tannin diversity. There's so many plants here whose survival really depends on their tannin abundance. And so I started fermenting a whole lot of plants, and found that the Eriocephalus africanus, the wild rosemary, was a perfect conditioner for my hair. And I mean, I'm like 19 or 20 years old at this stage, right? But then when I studied landscaping and horticulture around that time, and we had a big emphasis on indigenous plants because we have such a huge endemic diversity where we are, and also just a huge diversity of plants in general in the zone where we live. And so that was always such a huge emphasis. And I took that into thinking around food as well, because we were eating so many foods from other lands, right? Like where, how is it that we are at, a center of origin where humanity, there was a birth of humanity here, yet we're eating all these foods that are so from so far away. And so I started thinking through food from I don't want to say an academic perspective, because it really was so much more entrenched into my life. But at the time I was studying, and I needed a research project for horticulture. And because I'm such a, born in the city, and there were so many generations of us that have been born in the city, we are city people, but with such an affinity for non-city things, I wanted to understand how I could find solutions for kind of food issues in the city without having to go to rural areas and just, copy paste my lifestyle there, and just create more issues further afield. And so I did this research project around green roof systems and urban agriculture, which back then was so ahead of the game by then. I mean, like green roofs is nothing new, but here it definitely is. And there's a lot to be said also about when knowledge comes, when knowledge is shared or disseminated through a particular body type, if I can call it that. So I am how I would be classified here in terms of racial denomination is either as Cape Malay. So in apartheid regime, you would be Cape Malay or Indian or black or colored or white, right? And now we kind of say like Cape Malay is it's a misnomer, but you could say like colored. So I'm not quite black, not quite white, kind of thing. Plus I'm a woman, plus I'm young, and this can get a lot of people very agitated. And so especially when you're coming with new knowledge, or when you're coming across with really not challenging, but really actually challenging the status quo. I mean, my experience of injustice in the city was very much kind of city injustice, where you have like poverty lines and people begging at the traffic intersections, and people always asking for food, and the quality of food being, really great or really poor. There's a lot of hidden food, politics in the city that we don't recognize about, things that we know now. And so I made it my mission to bring in all these, like the reality of the rural poor, not just of the people but of the land, into the city, and sharing the story into the city to say like, yo, everything that we experience here, there's a story of where it comes from. But that story is so broken because there's a lot of injustice that has to happen in order for these, whatever it is that we're eating or consuming, to arrive where we are in the ways that it does, and the way that we kind of put all these fancy frames around certain elements of food, that has become so toxic, actually. Like the way that, there's this fad or the trend around anything from veganism to making fruit juices to like what, like the kind of diet culture, and all the complexities around food. In the places that I was working on the west coast of South Africa, in the north it's basically desert, and so people are expected or trying to, process or produce vegetables, but there's no water. And so a lot of the time people's diets, as it has been for generations, is high in meat, and they survive very well like that, and so thinking through, farming vegetables, because of that severing and that kind of colonial and apartheid regime, and forced removals, a lot of people didn't grow up on the farm or learning how to farm from their grandmother, like people would have done towards the east of the country, where there was still, people were in homelands. In the west of the country, it was not so. There was also genocide in the west of the country, all of these things. So, like teaching people, and here's this, us young people teaching the elders of those communities how to farm. Something was just not right. It's like we are not the knowledge holders. We just need to facilitate this process. And one of the huge areas there was a huge need was that people were planting everything at once and thus harvesting everything at once. So no one was staggering harvesting or seed sowing. And so they would just have huge wastage because there'd just be this mountain of whatever, tomatoes or green pepper. And people generally only made, jams or chutneys and things that required sugar and sterilization. And so access to market was very slow, and there's so much racism. And so, stores didn't want to buy from the farmers and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, like, we needed to learn how to preserve this stuff. And so that's where, so I'd been making, like, fermenting a few things, but then it became very obvious that, we needed a process that didn't necessarily require refrigeration. And so fermentation became a huge opportunity, and that subsequently has continued. And then, and a lot of the work I do around seed was also really born in this time. And then when I burnt out and I couldn't keep up with the pace of this political education and so on, because it was really eating my soul. And I ended up, went through a big depression where I was going to leave food and this is not for me and I need something replenishing. I was doing a lot of work for the slow food movement. We were kind of running the youth network in South Africa and pushing for an African youth network. I was doing so much and just using all my energy towards that because it was really something I believed in. Everybody needed to know about food. But in that depression that I landed in, I came to a new understanding of how I could operate, and really doing deep, dark work, calling on ancestors I'd never even met for guidance. And it was abundantly clear that food was still the path that needed to be walked, and to not let go of it and continue with the things that found me joy. And so I went back to the kitchen and back to the jars, back to the produce, and fell in love with it again, but found myself not in the state of needing to, be a producer and, save all the harvest from going to waste and be the one who would have all the answers for the farmers. No, it was about relaxing into the fact that my duty was way more about telling the story and keeping the relationships and keeping the access and all the privileges that I had to have that kind of access, but to tell the story in a way that was more powerful. And so as a means of honor, to be able to tell stories that will speak to all those different all the different heritages that we come from and I come from, that this landscape has seen and this landscape holds. And so, yeah, so the food journey becomes, this like a journeys that is able to traverse time and space and species and, even into a deep time.
How one can tackle like changes in food systems from like a personal perspective.
If you could see me, I'm indicating, all that political stuff, all the way the governments run and the way that corporations run, that stuff that's up here, that kind of governs the world or the way the world works. Two things is that the one is that it's all, really imagined. It's things where people have taken power or kind of forced agendas in a particular way. And the other thing, which I'll get back to in a second, but what the other thing that's important to think about is that all of those systems, the corporations and the governments and stuff, they're also inherited systems. So they also have their own way of being, and they've also learned their own way of being. So a good example is, if we in the contemporary reality of a place like South Africa, where we have this government that's been running. So Nelson Mandela, there was this kind of so-called democracy, a black president, all those things, wonderful, amazing, blah blah blah. Was very quick to see that what had happened was that the government that democracy brought us was really in many ways just inherited from that apartheid government. Same buildings, same, honestly, kind of ways of governing people, understanding people. I mean, it's not as if, you know, there were many other governance or systems of governance that were running from way before colonial times. But even this idea of corporations, it's also inherited from those colonial. I mean, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was a multinational corporation. And so basically what I'm trying to say is all that information is is very complex to think about, and it's some often held in kind of intellectual spaces or academic spaces that are not conducive to easy storytelling and also not that accessible to people. So to take all that information and translate it into thinking, and the easiest way for me to do that is to say, each individual, let us think about the ways that we consume things, and not just the food that we consume, but what do we use when we are feeling sick? What do we use to clean our teeth, to clean our homes, to brush our hair? How do we engage with our friends when we want to entertain ourselves? What are we using in our menstruation? What are we using, consuming in our sex lives? What are we, like, all the things that we use from, even in a synesthetic way, in all the different elements of our lives. How much of those consumeristic things, consumption things, need financial means to be engaged with? How much of it is a knowledge system that we can freely flow with? And if we think about that, how much of our survival depends on those consumptions and the ways that we consume, that we need actual, money for. So how much of our survival is embedded in a financialized system, basically? And so once you begin to think through those things and try to unhinge yourself from the more neoliberal concepts, or the ways that neoliberalism has and that kind of capitalism has really embedded itself in our survival, which, even our emotional selves, all of those things, then you can really begin to see how, fuck the system is, or how, not because the system actually works beautifully for what it's designed to do. I mean, how much of our own selves, our spirits, our cultures are embedded in this neoliberal system, and in which ways can we, I use the word unhinge, but which ways can we really unravel ourselves if we slowly had to follow the string and undo every knot?
Maybe it's also a bit related to what is also part of your activities, which is the indigenous food reclamation. And I would be very curious that you tell us more about that part of your work.
um, with indigenous food reclamation. So this is thinking about, like, also the rise of heirloom varieties, and the real, how gardening is all about the trends and all about the fashions and the fads. I mean, like, for hundreds of years it's been like this. So when heirloom plants came in, it was around the time that I was studying. And we started understanding that, what, you get black tomatoes and purple carrots and all these things, but then where is the indigenous food? And then beginning to excavate, and like, it really felt like an archaeological dig, like, into the minds of our communities, within my family and beyond, and in the spaces that I was occupying at that time. Literally, I'd be in the queue in the bank, or at the shopping center, whatever, at the grocery store, and I would just pick up a conversation with the person in front of me or behind me and be like, indigenous food, or like food that you grew up with that you don't have anymore, or what kind of foods was your grandmother eating or cooking, or do you remember blah 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 blah. And this idea of indigenous food was never even in the consciousness of people. There was never this, like, oh, what? There was a whole cuisine, or a whole, not a cuisine, but a whole way of, like, a whole foodways that was thriving, before colonial entry, that because of the huge diversity and biodiversity in this space, in the land and sea, the food here is, it's not only abundant, it's generous. There is such a generosity in how much food there is available on the mountain, on the veldt, in the dunes, in the sea, in the coastal zones. We have so much salt, we have so much, all the huge diversity of foods and even waters. I mean, this whole place is really the culture of people, and the relationship with this landscape has so much to do with water. And this place is full of sweet, sweet water.
It made me think of this situation, which was quite loud in media a couple years ago, that Cape Town was short on water. If there is abundance of sweet water, why there was an issue with water shortage in Cape Town, right?
The idea of damming in South Africa is really taking water from, everywhere in the world is like this, but taking water and collecting it from, so that it you neglect to let it flow in spaces that need it, where there are often settlements of people, because you need to feed a city. But the ways that the city is being fed is really, and became more and more abundantly clear in the drought, was that a lot of the water was being used in agriculture to feed the crops with herbicides and pesticides, and fungicides and so on, and huge kind of animal lots and these kinds of things. It wasn't like the household use was not where the issue was. But of course, the politics then talks to the fact that every citizen needs to make, what do you say, like, take part in finding a solution, because a lot of that agricultural system is not really feeding the nation. A lot of it is going to export. And if it does feed the nation, it's very thin nutrients. It's more about, making sure the working class is working, as opposed to, or surviving, as opposed to thriving. And so at that time, it became so clear, because the water that flows out of the mountain flows all the time. The mountain used to be the Table Mountain, right? The Table Mountain scape, the Table Mountain range. 5 million years ago used to be an island, and so it's always had its feet in the water. And this is one of the indigenous names of this place, is Hurikwaho, which is the mountain that rises from the sea, which is much more, not the mountain that rose from the sea, or the mountain that is in the sea. It's the rises. It's something that is, it's active. It's a very active naming, because the movement, the mountain may be still, but it's so surrounded by and entangled with all these relationships of different endemic insects and plants, and sometimes animals. And especially if you then go under the water, there are so many, 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 many more species beneath the water than there are above. And so the mountain has always had this beautiful relationship with the water. It acts as a giant sponge. There's just so many liters that flows out of the mountain. So not just in the mountain, but actually flows out of the mountain itself, and all the different tributaries and rivers that flow from the mountain. So this, drought was only a drought according to the fact that the dam was running low, which is valid, and it was a crisis, and it was very important to sort out. But I think the perspective was, and remains so embedded in that neoliberal way of thinking that it was very difficult to quantify how much, actual water we have when you're only looking at water from the perspective of what is coming through the kind of industrialized system.
All right, but let's come back to the topic of indigenous reclamation or revival.
I started thinking through this idea of indigenous food revival. But what ended up happening and what we really struggle with when ancient knowledge comes up again in this contemporary time, especially in a colonial country, a colonized country, is that knowledge immediately can get usurped into those that have benefited from colonial rule, so into whiteness basically, and completely bypass indigenous people or completely bypass anybody else who's not white, and it becomes very quickly exclusive. So we've seen like veganism do that, right? And organic food, same thing. It's kind of like just quickly gone into this like space of richness and wealth and exclusivity. And so you have to pay, for example, a lot more for this kind of stuff than ordinarily was, and is still, happening. And so that idea of indigenous food revival quickly became indigenous food reclamation because there was no political understanding with it. And because of, remember I told you that depression that I'd gone into with food stuff and just feeling like I was doing all this work and it was always just getting extracted into these spaces of whiteness, like with the slow food movement here in the local, in our territory, I was trying to think of how can indigenous food reclamation, how can our cuisine, how can we think about things in a much more broader way. So when I often find myself with tunnel vision and I'm really trying to work through a political problem around food, for example, I try to break open all the walls and see it from a much, look at it like an eagle does instead of an ant. And what ended up happening was that I would say, okay, so what is indigenous food? What is food? It is plants, the plants that we eat and the plants that we use to cook with. Maybe the plants like that we use to burn to make fire. So those kinds of things. I was thinking about the different kinds of waters that we have and we use, from seawater to, brakvat, like fresh water, sweet water, aquifers, all these kinds of things, right? And then thinking through minerals like clays that we use for food, like salts, different salts, the animals that we eat, that we work with, that we, use, eggs for vessels, all those kinds of things. And then it got to the microbes and realizing that here in that space, or that leg of thinking of food, especially indigenous food, became its own space in which indigenous food reclamation could really be big and really balloon into something that always carried that political consciousness, but never really had to be aggressive in that. So there was a much more gentle kind of self-care and healing that could come from that, and being completely placing that idea of indigenous food or indigeneity very firmly into where fermentation was placed or was based. And so always working from that space and taking it back to the fact that a lot of the indigenous food and the earliest recipes that we know of from this landscape had to do with fermentation also. So like making fermented honey, alcoholic beverage, for example, which is done a little bit differently than I've seen or have heard it done around the world.
After talking with our guest Zayaan Khan, I searched for that beverage. I believe it might be kari, a kind of a honey wine of the Khoisan people. which is believed to be one of the world's oldest alcoholic drinks, dating back 15,000 years. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening. Keep fermenting and stay tuned to the next episode of Ferment Radio.